This is the Editor's Half Hour. Step into the life of an editor for 30 minutes as we discuss the craft of editing, industry trends, and editorial resources. Your host is co-founder and CEO of Peak Publishing Inc., Nadia Jaja Pupa. She is experienced in all facets of the publishing industry, from editing to design, and works with corporate clients and self-published authors. Nadia and her guests are about to share powerful insights and stories on what it takes to be an editor. And this is your host, Nadia Jaja Pupa.
Welcome, listeners, to the Editor's Half Hour. We have an interesting episode today. We are covering tabletop role-playing games. This is a topic I've been wanting to cover for several months until I met the wonderful guest, my wonderful guest today, Rachel Lapido. But before I bring Rachel in, I want to shout out to another Rachel, Rachel Fowler. She is a special editor who I met in our magazine editors networking group. We meet once a month, and Rachel Fowler suggested this topic, so I promised her that I would give her a big shout out. So thank you, Rachel Fowler, for the topic, and I'd like to welcome Rachel Lapido. Welcome, Rachel. Welcome to the Editor's Half Hour. Please introduce yourself to our guests, and then we're going to just dive right into the topic of the role-playing games.
Hi, my name is Rachel Lapido. I'm a freelance copy editor, and I've been working on tabletop role-playing games for about, I think, 7 or 8 years now, and I'm thrilled to be here.
We are going to talk about so much, and just for our listeners to know, I think most of the listeners know that I always meet with my guests a couple days or a week before we record, and when I met with you, Rachel, I know I was all over the place, but it was so fun. It was just fun getting to know you, and you were answering a lot of questions I had about these, I guess I should use the acronym, which is TTRPG, which is Tabletop Role-Playing Games. And you answered a lot of really great questions, especially for somebody who is relatively new. And when I say relatively new, I should clarify that I do not play them, but I'm very interested in them. And you're so great. You're just a wealth of knowledge, actually. So let's just start from the beginning. How did you get into TTRPGs? What is your experience with them? And then we'll get deeper and deeper into the topic.
Sure. So back in, I think it was around 2016, I had just started my business as a freelance copy editor. And I was posting on Twitter, now X, and I was trying to be professional and be very, talking about grammar and spelling and things of that nature. And I wasn't getting a lot of traction, and I was getting a bit frustrated. So I just started posting about the things that I wanted to talk about, and that was things like Star Trek and Murder, She Wrote and The Expanse and apple cider donuts. And I live in Vermont, so we have awesome apple cider donuts. If you're ever here, let me know. I will give recommendations. But besides that, I got contacted from a creator who had a company in Hong Kong, Nine Dragons RPG, and he asked me, I see that you're a copy editor. Have you ever edited TTRPGs? And I said, no, but I would love to learn. I would love to do it. And he agreed. He gave me a job. I was able to, my husband is a huge TTRPG nerd. He has a bunch of books. I was able to look at his books, get a sense of what I should be doing. And I did that first project for the creator from Hong Kong, and then he gave me another job. And from there, he introduced me to another editor who works exclusively in TTRPGs, and that editor said, that I was doing what needed to be done, and he introduced me to other creators in the US, and then I got more jobs, and then just word of mouth, and I just have been doing them since.
That's awesome. And that's honestly how so much works in the editorial world, where you're exposed to, whether it's a specific industry, in fiction, there's so many subgenres under main genres, and it's really cool to see how things unfold. And so that's really how it was, is you just got the job and then, went from there, and you were given more because you really enjoyed it. And I loved listening to some other interviews. And Rachel, you were on another podcast, and I can put that in the show notes as well. I think it was on the Tech Lounge. And
Yes.
that was what I listened to and heard some really interesting things about the challenges, the types of things that come up that don't typically come up in other things in the editorial world. And so getting to just setting the foundation, especially for listeners who know nothing about TTRPGs, what is it that we're really looking at? You mentioned already a book, which is the rule book that's laying the whole thing. I mean, that's building the world, setting the rules, really defining the game and the parameters within the game. What other things are there that you know about that maybe you have edited in the past? I mean, what is it as just a foundation to explain to the listeners?
So when you have a big game, something like Dungeons and Dragons, you have a bunch of different books. So you have manuals that are just for the players, manuals that are just for the dungeon master, the DM. You have monster manuals that it's listing all the monsters that you might potentially come across in your journeys.
Cool.
So I have worked on, a lot of times with smaller games, what I have worked on is the rule books, just because that's sort of the best way to package the game as a whole for a new player, someone who's new to that game. I've also worked on what's called adventures. So these could be things where the creator, you know what the rules are, you know how to create characters, and then they say, okay, so now you're going to do a bank heist, say. And this book is going to walk you through where the bank is and what the guards are who guard the bank are like and why you're going to be robbing this bank. And they're sort of laying out all of that groundwork. They're going to introduce the NPCs, the non-player characters that you're going to meet around that bank. So that's sort of what an adventure book would be. And I've worked on those, and I've also worked on rule books.
Okay. And are you provided like a character list of the actual main characters or the player, or you're going to have to help me with this. Is it the player characters and the non-player characters separate lists, or do you create those lists while you're building the style sheet? I mean, how does that, is it probably different for every project, right?
So with player characters, those are the characters that the people who are playing the game, they create those. And because they create those, they're not in the book. You will have guidance for creating them. You will sometimes be given, so for instance, I'm just going to use Dungeons and Dragons as an example, but so if you're going to create an elf character, they will give you in the book, they'll give you an example of like, here are first names, a lot of common first names for elves, and here are some common last names for elves, and traits that elves would commonly have. So that's something that they would provide that, but they wouldn't be providing, they're not going to say Sam Smith is a player character. So they're not going to do that. With the creators who I work with, I don't get a list like that. Generally I get the manuscript. I might be getting them in sections. I might be getting the whole thing at once. I don't get a list of the different NPCs. So that's something that I do put in my style sheet, and that's an important thing to keep in my style sheet because those change sometimes. I've had genders of NPCs change midway through projects, so I need to, it's happened multiple times, so I need to be like, wait a second, Jackson is now Jackie? Is this brother and sister? Is this the same person? So I have to just keep track of that on my style sheet. That's like a big thing that I keep track of on the style sheet.
Okay, so the style sheet, you maintain the list of the NPCs and all that. Is that what you're saying? Okay. And so, I can't wait. Let's just jump into the style sheet because we don't really need to stay on the foundation that long. It's enough to get a sense of what is a role-playing game, what are the things that you look at. But on the editorial side, what is it that differentiate that? There's the editing like fiction, right? This is similar, but not quite the same because there are so many specific elements that you're looking at and that absolutely have to be consistent when you're playing a game. And there cannot be any room for any sort of maybe this means the same thing. It really does need to be clear when you're setting those rules and parameters. So why don't you share some of those unique challenges when it comes to editing these TTRPGs? What are the unique challenges? What are the types of things that go into a specific style sheet?
So I had one example. This was on Blue Planet Recontact. So this was a massive game that's called a cli-fi, so climate fiction game. And it's also a little bit, it's a crunchier game set. So the rules, there's a lot more rules guiding it. It's not a very, there's some games that are looser in terms of if it's cool, you can do it. And then there's other games where there's a lot more rules, you know, governing what you can do, what you can't do, and things like that. So with this game, there was an NPC, a non-player character, who was a lieutenant in an eco-terrorist group. And the group was doing smuggling, drug running, weapon trafficking, things like that. And he had worked his way up the ranks. He had been on the street level, and now he was a lieutenant in it. And the character was being described and saying has -1 to negotiation skills. And I said, hang on, that doesn't make sense. This is someone who started out, worked his way up. He's a good negotiator. We've been told that he's a good negotiator. So okay. I sent a question to my creator, to the client I was working with. I said, is this -1? I'm confused by it. He says, oh, that was supposed to be a +1.
Wow.
So, and it's easy enough. I mean, it's the same key, actually. When you type like the little minus with the little plus symbol, it's the same key. You just depends on if you have the shift on or not. So it's a lot of times it was me looking at that going, does this make sense? Does it make sense that this character would have a -1 for a negotiation skill? No, it wouldn't. So that's why I've just learned to ask. So that's part of the thing with working on TTRPGs. It's not just keeping consistency across sections, but it's also asking yourself, does this make sense? You know, I remember there was one that I worked on that was a fantasy game, and they had these the pieces of armor, and they had like these things that would go on your arms, almost like gauntlets, and they're called, they're sort of like lobster gauntlets or something. Like it'd just be like this, like a lobster. Okay. And they were talking about the traits of that, and I said, won't this affect the climbing speed of the player characters? Because you can't climb well if you're wearing those. And they said, oh, yeah, you're right. We should make a note of that, because otherwise you would be able to wear those and still be able to climb a rope as if you were barehanded. And that just didn't make sense. And that would potentially give some players a little bit of an unfair advantage in certain situations. So it's just looking at those things and asking yourself, does this make sense? And that's a big part of it.
These are such great examples. I mean, you're really showing how you are taking a step outside as an objective observer, reading the material. Obviously, you're editing for grammar and punctuation, but you're really thinking critically about the non-player characters, the NPCs. You're saying, like you said, does this make sense? Something as simple as a plus or -1, that affects the whole game experience. And then that would lead to confusion. Then that may or may not lead to arguing among the players. So I really, really love hearing this stuff. And I think you can apply these same skills to things outside of TTRPGs. So whether you work in them or not, I think listeners can really gain a lot from hearing your perspective. So do you have other examples? Do you have any other tricky examples or challenges that you've experienced in working in this stuff?
So going back to Blue Planet, and that, because I worked on that for a couple of years, it's over 600 pages, and my style sheet for that ended up being over 140 pages.
Oh my God.
Yes.
That's a beast.
It was a beast. And one of the things that was in that style sheet was a timeline. Now, there was a section where my client had created a timeline for the game, but at that point, I had been keeping my own because some of the events were not lining up. And part of this was because a lot of different authors were working on the different sections, and some of these chapters were written new for this edition, but this game originally came out in the 90s. So a lot of the chapters were from back then. And that meant So there a lot of things had changed over that time. Names had changed, places had changed, characters had changed. And so I just started keeping my own timeline. And I had an instance where we were told that this character had been the captain of this space station for 8 years. And I looked at my timeline and I said, no, I actually had put in when he had started at that space station. And then I looked at what the year was when we were told that he was there for 8 years. And I said, actually, it's 7 years. And I pointed that out to my client, and he was very happy because I was just keeping track of things. I mean, I was also keeping track of populations of cities because some of those had changed over time. So it was, and because this was a game where it's taking place over 2 solar systems, so you have multiple populated planets, populated moons, space stations. So I needed to have this to keep track of it, and I didn't just have the timeline, I also would have the locations of it just so that I could easily see where these events were happening. And that just helped me keep track of everything.
What was it like working on it? I mean, did you have dreams at night of being in different solar systems?
It was very strange, and I sometimes went down really deep rabbit holes that I didn't necessarily need to, and my client would be like, please don't worry that much about this, because he had an entire chapter about whale biology, and I was trying to fact check everything. And so, I mean, now I know more whale facts, so that is good. But, it was funny because my husband used to be, like, he graduated, he got his degree in math, but before that he was a marine biology major.
You're kidding.
No.
Oh my God.
There was a couple times when I was able to say, like, does this make sense? Like, whale biology wise, but I was just, I was doing a lot, like just a lot of research, a lot of looking up things. So yes, so I know more.
Oh my God.
So that's good.
That's good. That's the thing is, as editors, and because you're probably just genuinely curious, to be honest, like, you're just genuinely curious. You're like, well, actually, I do kind of want to fact check this just to see. And then before you know it, you are jumping down a deep rabbit hole and learning more than you realized you ever would. And how do you manage that? I mean, because are you tracking hours? Are you tracking, or do you charge per word? How do you manage that as an editor? That's the tough part.
So with this project, I was charging per the word, but I do keep track of my time just so that I know how long these kinds of projects take me. And I was trying to keep track of, like, the different sections, because some sections just would take longer than others, the ones that had a lot of facts and then that I had to check. And sometimes by facts, it could even just mean facts that had been created for the game, but that I had to double check against existing chapters. So yeah, I was just trying to keep track of the general, like, how much time it was taking me to do it. So yeah, and I did end up down a few Wikipedia rabbit holes, but it's not bad, and oftentimes you're able to use those things later on. I've been able to use, I had another game where I had to look up a lot of expressions from, like, pirates and merchant sailors and things like that, and I've used that for other projects. So it's not, I'm like, this was a really good resource, I'm going to use this again. So that's the thing, you just want to, like, save your bookmarks so that you can find them again.
I love this. Now I'm really going to talk you into doing a blog, because I feel like the time that you spend on things and the resources that you've gathered, I mean, that right there would be a great blog. I'd love to read pirate stuff, like, as a blog post. I mean, think about how beneficial that would be, just even for these game creators and writers. So yeah, it's something to think about. I'm gonna follow up after this interview, and I'll be like, hey, Rachel, how's that blog coming along?
Oh no. I've got enough going on.
So let's talk about the game creator side of things, because we're obviously the editors, and that's a different perspective that we're bringing. You know, when we had a chance to chat, it was really cool to hear your perspective, because you were open and honest about, this space is a male dominated space, and and that's fine and it's good, but it's one of those things where you kind of opened up and shared that some content probably needed some sensitivity readers. Bringing in some inclusive language is important. So how did you navigate that? Let's share with the listeners a little bit of your perspective on, knowing when and how do you discuss that with the creator, bringing in that sensitivity reader.
So one thing with a lot of the games that you see that are on the market, a lot of them have settings that are it's sort of like vaguely European, like sort of vaguely medieval Europe, or the old West America. And when it's that, for the most part, that's fine. That's sort of the standard. But then sometimes you will have creators who, they are not members of certain groups and they don't have a relationship with that group, and they haven't done much research beyond looking at a couple Wikipedia pages, but then they want to include a group, a culture, a race into the game. And that can be problematic because, just reading a couple Wikipedia pages on, the gods of a certain culture isn't going to give you enough background to really put that into the game. And so whenever I come across that, I advise my clients to hire someone who is a member of that group, or who at least has a relationship with that group, to look over the content and to check it and to make sure, because I think you really risk alienating people who are from that culture or race or group, or just people who know that, that's a gross oversimplification. So that's one thing that I advise. Another thing that I see happen a lot, and this is a lot less problematic, but it's still kind of a bummer, honestly, is that when you have a new game, and they're advising you on how to create your characters, a lot of times they'll give examples, like pop culture examples. So I had one where it was a sci-fi game, and my client, who was the main writer, he was giving, famous captains. So he had like Captain Picard, and he had like Captain Sisko, like both from Star Trek, and like Captain Kirk also from Star Trek. And yeah, those are great captains, but there was, I think, about 6 examples. They were all men, and most of those men were white men, and that's a bummer. I mean, well, where's Janeway from Voyager? Where's you can even go with someone like Leela from Futurama. There's a lot of other examples that you can go that are not just white men. And so with that, what I did there was I didn't just rely on what I knew for pop culture references, because I know that there's a lot of, sci-fi fantasy stuff that I haven't seen or read. But I did some research, trying to find what are some more, people who are in pop culture who have held these kinds of jobs. Because the way it was like, jobs like assassin or therapist or captain or things like that. And I also found that when he had the therapist role, all the examples he gave were women, and again, mostly white women. And there's sort of this, in a lot of pop culture, you will see sort of like the girl of the group, and she's the one who's worried more about emotions and feelings and communication and things like that. And it's an important role, but it's oftentimes the role that is just the default female role. So right. you want to have you could have Frasier Crane. I'm not saying that would be necessarily the best model for a therapist character, but I mean, it would be different. And so you just want to not make people feel, because you're going to have players, hopefully, who are, they're not white or they're non-binary. And so you want to have them be able to look at this game and see themselves represented in it. If you don't see yourself represented in the game, you just don't feel as much of a connection. You're not going to want to play it. And if you don't want to play it, you're not going to buy the other things that come out from that creator.
I love that. I love hearing your perspective on this, and, providing some of that knowledge and maybe even some resources for the creator if you feel like they need that. And I love that you've got that sense of purpose too when you're working with these writers, and it's so great. And from my experience, again, somebody completely outside of this world, it looks like a really fun community. And I was watching some videos trying to learn about I didn't even know what an NPC stood for. And I'm like, okay, now I get it. And I saw, GM, that stood for Game Master. And then I saw some other videos where they called it a game moderator. And so I'm seeing that there is maybe a little bit of a shift happening in just the general terms that are being used for the game. And I thought that was really interesting. And so that's just some input on a different perspective, and it is truly the editor's job. And I love just your overall message of sharing the editor's voice. And I think the editor does have a voice, and it is tough for us to view ourselves in that way, because as editors, we really do work behind the scenes. We really are that quiet worker, and we're not in the spotlight. We didn't create the game. However, we are putting in our voice and our concerns from an outside perspective. So I love that. I love hearing that from your role as the editor. So yeah, there's still so much that we could talk about, and I want to now get into more of your workflow, the types of tools that you use. Do you use any special tools? What is your workflow like? In fact, we could go back to the beginning of, what is that first thing that you tackle when you are given one of these big projects? How do you manage everything?
So, in terms of tools, I use Perfectit. Love that. I have different style sheets that I've created for different clients that I've worked with, so that if I work with them again, I can just fire that up and I can usually catch a lot of inconsistencies right there. I also use Text Expander, and that saves me from having to type as much. And I also use Trello for the checklists, so that way I'll just create checklists of things to check in a game, and then I can just check them off of that, and that has been a huge help. One of the first things I do, so after I like to read through the game, but the next step after that is I like to create the style sheet, and I have different templates that I use, and so then that way I don't have to create it from scratch every single time, but then I can just start looking at that and putting in the information as I go along. And I do tend to make fairly long style sheets, as you've heard previously, but I find that that's helpful for me.
Okay. That's great. And I love hearing how other editors work and what tools they use. And Perfectit is one of those, especially when it comes to maintaining consistency. It's one of those things you just kind of have in some ways. So that's great to hear. So, speaking about the community in general, I like that you used Crunchy as a way to define a Crunchy system. That's new to me. And I think that means that it's rule heavy. Yeah. Do you have some other community specific terms that mean something, whether it's defining a genre within the world? I think it'd be interesting for you to share some of those if you have any that come to mind.
Well, there's Hope Punk. So that is one of the early games I worked on is Return to the Stars, and that's what I would refer to as a rules light system. So that means that the rules they're less strict. It's more the rule of cool, which is basically if someone does something, and even if the rules kind of say that maybe they shouldn't be able to do that, or maybe that's not how that tool should be used, the moderator kind of gets to weigh in, and if it's really cool, they sometimes are encouraged to let it go through. So that's that game. That's the rule of cool, but it's Hope Punk, which is sort of a genre. So it's opposed to Grimdark. So Grimdark is, now I'm very unfamiliar with Warhammer, but Warhammer is supposed to be a little bit more like that. So it's usually darker, grittier. Usually it could be apocalyptic or close to being an apocalyptic situation. Hope Punk is where it's the combinations of it. There is hope, but it's the punk element is usually, it is sort of set more generally in the future, where you have more computers and technology. It might be AI, it might be in space, but the punk element is that you have a band of people who want to make things better, and they're going to use the tools to help make things better and to fight corruption where they see it. But there's usually, it's a more positive vibes.
Very cool. This is so cool. I mean, this is stuff I know nothing about, and I love hearing your perspective on it. So you mentioned, was it called Blue Planet or
Blue Planet?
Blue
Yes.
Planet. Would you say that was probably the biggest project that you ever had?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
Is that the one that you're probably the most proud of, or what would you say of all the games that you've worked on?
I mean, I'm very proud of that, but I'm also very proud of, I worked on, so I've done work in the past for DC Comics as a freelancer, and they knew about my TTRPG background, and they have a comic called The Last God, and they did a short adventure set in using the rule set of D&D 5th edition, and so I was the proofreader on that, and
cool.
It was very cool, and that was one of the first times I had my name in a book, and I was credited as the lead proofreader, and that was pretty awesome.
Oh, that is awesome. Very, very cool. And that builds your reputation, and it adds to your experiences, and so it's really, really cool to see how deep you are in this world, and it's really cool. I mean, you know so much, and even just hearing you talk about it is so cool. Like, I think in the last interview, I mentioned the other podcast you were on where you talked about just something as simple as a spell and the name of a spell that's used, and then it was called something else. And I feel like this is tapping into that territory of really needing that editor. This is not stuff that I think AI would know to pick up on. It would run through, and then how would it know to think critically about something that sounds similar to something else? But again, it really does require that editorial perspective to call things into question. Because then if you're using a spell, what was it that do you remember what example I'm talking about?
I know. So that was also from Return to the Stars, which was the Hope Punk game. And I can't remember the exact spell, but it was something like Starshine and then like Sunbeam, something like that. And I had come across one of them, and I said, I am not familiar with this spell. Is this a different spell? Does it do something different? And I asked my client, and he said, oh, I forgot the name of the first spell, so I just slapped this in there. I said, you can't do that. But, because I just imagine how much confusion that would be. If in D&D there's a spell that I like to use a lot called Moonbeam, and that is an established spell, but there are so many arguments over how it works and what you can and can't do with it. So if you had named it Lunar Light someplace else, that would have been so confusing. So yeah, I see my role as not just being the editor, but just wanting to help make arguments not happen at the table. Just decrease the possibility of arguments happening at the table, because that's not fun. You don't want to be arguing over rules when you're playing a game.
Right. You want to really dive into the experience and have fun with it. And I think that's the cool thing is, you're hyper aware and focused on the things that could be potentially a problem maker if it doesn't have clear guidelines. So to wrap up this conversation, again, I do think that we could really get into this and go deeper. But for an editor who's interested, an editor who's into TTRPGs and thinks, oh, well, that would be a dream to work on these. I mean, what sort of advice do you have for an editor who is interested, or even an editor who's already doing it? What advice can you give them to improve their skills and to pay attention to the things that you pay attention to?
I think it's great if you can be in a group with other people, because that's really helped me get a better sense of how people read the rules and understand them, because you're always going to have in your group the rules lawyer, the person who's going to try to find a loophole and be able to do exactly what they want to do. And I'm not that person, and my husband isn't either, but in our group we have a person who does that. So now when I'm reading rules, I go, what would he do if he was reading this rule? And that helps me kind of put myself into the mind of different people. And some people are, they're able to remember really complex details, and other people, they only get to do it once a month or once every 2 months. And I try to keep the different people in my group in mind when I'm editing now, and trying to see it from how they would see those rules, see that content written. So I think that that's helpful a lot. And I would also say just reading a lot of like fantasy, sci-fi, horror, whatever genres that you're into, like what kind of games you want to play, knowing what your clients are referring to when they're talking about things, I think that that's really helpful. So my youth was spent well, apparently, watching a lot of Star Trek, watching a lot of Stargate, so
I love that.
not so much Star Wars, but so being able to do that and know where these references are coming from, I think also helps a lot.
Oh, that's such great advice. I love that. And I love that you said that you're putting all of your interests to good use. All of your interest in sci-fi. I mean, what a great way to see everything, in your life come to fruition. You're using your skills, So, so how can our listeners find you? What's the best way for them to find you? Are you active on social media, LinkedIn, Threads, Instagram? Where can we lead our listeners to find you?
So probably the best would be on Blue Sky. So I'm there at Editrix Rachel. So it's Editrix, and then I believe it's -Rachel. I also have a website, which is www.rachellapido.com. And I'm also on LinkedIn under Rachel Lapido. I'm the only one with that name. So those are all good places to find me.
Excellent. And I'll definitely be sure to put all of those in the show notes. So definitely reach out to Rachel if you have questions. But I just want to say thank you so much, Rachel. This has been an awesome, very interesting, and very unique topic to cover on the podcast. So I'm just thrilled that we were able to have this interview. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Editor's Half Hour. This podcast is your go-to resource for editorial trends, opening the discussion for new ideas through the real-life stories of editors. For more information about Nadia Jaja Pupa and her business, visit peakpublishing.com. That's PIQUE publishing.com. And remember to subscribe and follow the Editor's Half Hour wherever you get your podcasts.